Yeah, big thank you to Matt and to the BMI for inviting me to join you here in Nashville. It's my first time in Nashville. Can't wait to be experiencing Broadway later on this evening. I've got the boots with me and the buckle. I just need to buy a Stetson hat, and that'll be good fun. So I'm going to speak this morning about a very, very complex and a rather tough subject, EUDR. So EUDR stands for the European Union Deforestation Regulation. It's actually a regulation that's been voted in June 2023. So it should have been on all of our radars for a while. However, that's probably not been the case. It was actually delayed from implementation at the end of last year to the end of this year. And I know a lot of people out there in this room are probably wondering, is this actually going to happen, or is it going to be delayed again? I think the bookmakers at the moment have it odds on that this is going to be coming in at the end of this year. So given now that we're end of April, May, the summer's coming, it's getting to that crunch period where we need to start seriously speaking about this. So I'm going to assume that everyone in the room has at least a basic understanding of what EUDR is, to go into the nitty-gritty of the subject. However, if that's not the case, don't hesitate to reach out to me afterwards, because I've unfortunately been living this for the last 8 or 9 months pretty much full time. So I'm going to move on now. So a quick introduction about myself. So I'm another Matt. I think we've got about 4 or 5 Matts in the room today. I'm Matt Baldwin, so European, British, Irish, French. I've been working 5 years as a consultant with PwC in a previous life. And then the years where I knew BMI, I was 15 years with CPI Books. So CPI Books are Europe's largest book printer, printing about 400 million books. I left there at the end of 2023 to find my own consultancy firm as an independent in 2024. It's a bit eclectic, the mix of activities that I do. So I work in mergers and acquisitions, of course, sustainability, where I work with Bloomsbury Publishing, so the guys who publish Harry Potter, who's a UK publisher. Thanks to Brexit, that means they're no longer in the EU, and so they've got the same challenges as many of the publishers and printers in this room have today. I also do some consultancy on operation, implementation of KPIs, performance improvement, and inkjet printing. So first of all, just to set the context, here's a little bit of a reminder of what EUDR is and why it matters. So the motivation for EUDR was a noble one. Europe wanted to reduce its impact on the world, its indirect impact on deforestation across the world, by ensuring or trying to ensure that all the products sold within the European Union market was free from either deforestation or forest degradation. They targeted 7 commodities identified as being key sources for deforestation, and particularly the transfer of use of land from forests into agriculture. And so those 7 commodities, rearing of cattle, cocoa, coffee, palm oil, rubber, soy, and wood, which of course paper and books is a very, very tiny bit of. So you can clearly see that when the EU came up with this regulation, books was nowhere near the center of their focus, and even less so were book manufacturers in North America or outside the EU. So this places us in a particularly complicated situation. So the onus, in order to ensure those products within the EU are free from deforestation, is for anyone who's looking to place a product on the EU market to perform due diligence on that product to ensure that there's a negligible risk that any of the commodities, so those 7 commodities again, that I just referenced here, were a source of deforestation when they were harvested. It's really quite technical in terms of your requirements, and I won't go into detail here, but you have to collect all these items here. So there's got to be a description of products, quantity, country of production, key points, geolocation coordinates, GPS coordinates, for all the timber in our case that has been harvested to make the pulp, to make the paper that's going into the books that we're producing. And so that's really rather onerous. And so for the book industry, which hasn't, unlike, for instance, the food industry, been tracing its supply chain in detail for many, many years, this poses a unique challenge. So what happens if we're not compliant? So the EU has placed responsibility on national competent authorities to police the EUDR, and so they have obligations in checking the number of due diligence statements coming to the system to ensure that they're actually compliant. So there's supposed to be at least checks of 1% when those products are considered low risk, 3% for standard, and 9% for high risk. So that's an awful lot of checking that they're supposed to be doing. The list of competent authorities is in the process of being published. It's pretty much complete now, but effectively there's a national actor for each country within the EU who's been named. The penalties of non-compliance, of being found to be non-compliant, are pretty onerous as well. So there's naming and shaming of those who have been found guilty and prosecuted for non-compliance on their websites. There's a maximum of fine which cannot be less than 4% of all turnover realized within the EU, plus other penalties including confiscation of any revenues related to non-compliant products, and then also those products themselves could be seized. So it's a big deal in terms of both reputation and in terms of financial penalties for non-compliance. Now, I'm hoping we're going to share these slides because this one's a little bit complicated, but you can have a look at it afterwards. But I wanted to explain a little bit what the due diligence requirements are. So the idea is that for all products produced after the 29th of June 2023, so that is the date at which they voted through the regulation, there is some due diligence performed on that product. So the European Union is due to publish what we call a country risk benchmarking. They're supposed to take all the countries in the world and then to categorize them between low, standard, and high risk. So that's due to come out before the end of June this year, 6 months before implementation of the EUDR. We'll see if they manage it. But if the product comes from a low-risk country, so one might imagine that the EU is pretty generous to itself and considers countries such as Finland, Scandinavia, where a lot of the pulp comes from in the EU, to be low risk, then assuming you tick another couple of boxes, then all you have to do is to collect the original geolocation data, species data on the forests and the trees are being harvested, and then file that via a DDS, which is a due diligence statement, into the EU's IT system called EU Tracers. However, for all other cases where there's standard or high risk, then you enter into a process where you have to perform some detailed due diligence, which looks at, for instance, the geolocation of the harvested trees to make sure that they weren't originated from forests that have suffered from forest degradation or deforestation since the end of 2020. Then you also have to do a number of legality checks, looking at legal documentation, timber rights, etc., to ensure that those trees were legally forested as well, harvested. Assuming that you can complete all that assessment and come to the conclusion, justify a conclusion, that there's negligible risk of those products being non-compliant, then you file a DDS system in EU Tracers, and you're good to go. If you're not, and you're unable to mitigate those risks through a number of mitigation procedures, then the product is non-compliant, and you're not allowed to be selling that product within the EU. So what's the current timeline for compliance? We mentioned earlier it's been delayed. Here's a timeline reference. The two dates on the far left are important. The date of December 2020 is taken almost as like a photo of the forest coverage of the world as it was then. And when you're looking at geolocation data to determine whether there's been any deforestation, you're basically comparing the evolution of the forest since 2020. If there has been deforestation or forest degradation, and the geolocation is on that area, then there's a clear risk of deforestation, and you've got to delve deeper into that. The date, 30th of June, or 29th of June 23, represents the date where the regulation was voted in, and any product that's placed on the EU market that was produced prior to that date is exempt. So if you produce some books on the 28th of June 2023, and then you send those books into Europe from the 1st of January 26, they're actually exempt. Exactly how you're going to be able to prove that those books were produced before 29th of June 2023 isn't quite clear yet, but that's per the legal regulation as it stands. Since then, a couple of important dates. I mentioned the EU tracer system in which we're supposed to be interacting to be filing these due diligence statements. That actually went live at the end of December 24, and there are two versions of that system. One is a test system, so you can try and play around with it and see how you can interact with the system. And another one is live, which actually has legal weighting. So be careful about playing with the live one. Then afterwards, most recently, as a couple of weeks ago, we had the publication of a 4th edition of Frequently Asked Questions from the European Commission and some guidance notes. It's supposed to give us some help on how we apply the regulation in practice. But I must say they're pretty skimp pickings, because you've got to remember this regulation is for 7 commodities out there, and timber is just one, and books is a very small part of that. So it's relatively small in terms of what we can glean from information there. So the EC has committed to publishing the country risk benchmarking by the end of June 25. They said it's got to be at least 6 months before the implementation of the regulation. The latest rumors I heard last week is that they think they're going to come out with this before then. However, there is so much political fallout from considering countries' high risk, etc., that they're looking likely to be considering most, if not all, countries as standard risk. So it's not going to be very much help at all. Then the dates for implementation, December 25 for most companies, other than small and medium-sized companies. And small companies get an extra 6 months to reach compliance till June next year. So the focus really has to be, and that's what's really interesting for everyone in the room, is the impact on publishers and printers who are outside the EU. Because actually, as I'll show on the next couple of slides, when you drill down to it, there is a big, big difference between whether you've got an EU-based supply chain or whether your supply chain is outside. So the truth is, most companies are going to be impacted, because it's really difficult to know whether, when you're printing your books, what proportion are going to be destined for the EU market. Of course, you've got direct sales into the EU to EU publishers. You've also got indirect sales. So you could be selling to Amazon, who then selling on into the EU market. So unfortunately, it's difficult to kind of segregate what you're going to be printing that's EU bound and what isn't EU bound. So in an ideal world, you'd be looking to render everything compliant so you can sell it wherever you want without any worry of that. The other thing that's become apparent over the last year or so, which I've been working on it, is that the supply chain, we cannot split the supply chain into two. Distribution warehouses, returns, etc., make it extremely, extremely difficult, without even talking about data, to have a stream of compliant products and then non-compliant products. So certainly the position that, for instance, UK publishers are taking are on the doorstep of the EU market is that all product has to be compliant, and we can only manage one stream of product. So then afterwards, it's quite easy for the EU actors in the supply chain, because under the regulation, pretty much everyone has to comply. So it's an existential threat for any EU-based companies. Whereas for anyone outside the EU, in most cases, you won't even be cited under regulation as an operator or a trader. So theoretically, you don't have any legal obligations. Of course, in reality, your EU customers will want to know that the books they're buying are compliant. So you, at the very minimum, will have a duty to be supplying the data so they can demonstrate compliance of that product and be sure that they're buying compliant product from yourselves. So I've looked to illustrate that with a couple of scenarios. This is the first for an EU-based supply chain, just to show how easy it is really for them. So here we're imagining that there's a pulp mill in Finland, a paper mill in Sweden, a printer in Spain, a publisher in Germany, and then a retailer in France. Here, every single actor, because they're either transforming the product from one to another. So in the first instance, we're taking trees and turning them into pulp. For the paper mill, we're taking the pulp and turning it into paper. The printer's obviously taking multiple paper components, turning it into a book. Or thereafter, the publisher is consolidating the various impressions that have been made with the different printers into an ISBN that they're then selling on to the retailer. So each of these actors here is going to have to interact with the EU Traces system, demonstrate their compliance with regulation by posting DDSs, and then they can be sharing down that chain, downstream. It's quite simply the DDS references that is in the EU Traces system, and potentially the verification number, and the verification number would then give the downstream actors access via EU Traces to the underlying geolocation data that's therein. So this is really easy. Every actor has to be compliant because it's an existential threat to their business. And really all we're sharing down the chain from the pulp mill are the DDS references that could be rolled up once into a paper, once into a book, and then one into an ISBN with multiple impression numbers. So there it's nice and simple. And that's really what the focus was of EUDR when it was thought of. Now here's the nightmarish scenario for a non-EU supply chain, and it really is quite complex. So here I'm imagining that the pulp mill is in Canada. We've got a paper mill in the US, printer in the US, publisher in the UK, because I'm British, and then an EU retailer. So the issue here is that the first person under regulation who is compelled to demonstrate compliance of the product is actually the EU retailer. But that could be a small bookshop in the middle of France who hasn't got even a clue what EUDR is. But theoretically, as a regulation stands, for these books to be compliant, all the actors along the supply chain would have to be sharing the underlying data all the way down to this poor retailer, this poor French bookshop, who would then have to interact with EU Traces to demonstrate compliance. And I've done some of the supply chain mapping, and you'd be surprised when you start looking at where pulp comes from, etc., just how wide and varied those are. And so I've run the numbers, and on this scenario, for a title which has a significant number of reprints, you're going into hundreds of thousands, if not millions of lines of data. And so the idea that the retailer at the bottom is going to be able to take all that data and demonstrate compliance is, quite frankly, is infeasible. And it doesn't really work, unfortunately. So what's the approach that we could be looking to take from a very practical point of view? Because the worst thing you can do with EUDR is call up a lawyer, say, how do I comply with EUDR, and then try and apply the letter of what he's telling you. In reality, for non-EU supply chains, rather than duplicating and storing that data at every single point in the supply chain, which will also require building a number of data centers, and which is just incredible, it's crazy. The idea is we've been lobbying the EU to provide access to EU Traces for non-EU actors. So anywhere in the world, UK, North America, East Asia, etc. Apparently, the latest feedback is that they're still considering this option. So this might change, but if it's going to change by the 30th of June, because after the 30th of June, they've agreed there will no longer be any changes. if the EU doesn't open up EU traces to non-EU operators, we've also been looking at workaround options. So in order to be able to register with the online system, effectively you only need really one thing, and that's what we call an EUDR number. So an economic operator's registration and identification number. And all this number does is effectively give EU customs a single reference number to identify with whom they are dealing with. So we've been recommending to a number of printers, as Bloomsbury, that they apply to the EU for an EUDR number, and there you have to apply to each national government. So if most of your book printing goes into France or Ireland, you apply to France or Ireland for this EUDR number. So there are no legal impacts of registering with EU traces from getting this EUDR number as far as the regulation is concerned. So it will still be incumbent from a legal perspective on the EU importer of record to demonstrate compliance. All you are effectively then doing is ensuring that the data sets that we're managing down the supply chain are manageable. And it's also quite important when you think about it that you've demonstrated by obtaining that DDS reference that your product is compliant. Otherwise, I don't think any retailer is going to be ordering books from someone who can't demonstrate that, because they won't be able to sell it on in the market. So then afterwards, this is a really complex data problem, and the traceability of the supply chain, as I said earlier, is something the book industry hasn't had to look at prior. So the digital side of things is really very, very important. There are obviously existing certification bodies, FSC, PFC, and in the US, North America, SFI. There's also a book chain projects initiative as well to look at managing the data. So what these certification bodies, etc., are trying to do with new EUDR modules is to take the data from the mills on geolocation, species data, legality, etc., and then via a number of automated solutions, AI, etc., to be able to do the due diligence on behalf of the rest of the supply chain to get comfort on the compliance of this product. However, it must be said that with all the promise that we saw last year from FSC, PFC, it's gone very, very quiet and ominously quiet at the beginning of this year. And I think everyone thought last year might be a silver bullet solution, but it's clearly not going to be. Could be part of the solution, but it won't be the whole solution. So then, as we're going to talk with a couple of our panel partners in a little bit, there are a number of software solutions out there that will help you with traceability of the supply chain and also adding on the EUDR element in terms of risk assessments, due diligence. I've just listed a few here, including the two we'll be talking with today, Livio and Osapiens. But there are at least 20 solutions that I've identified out there in the market. So the functionalities of these solutions, basically the core functionalities is looking to collect the data from the upstream, from the paper mills, from the pulp mills, etc. They perform the risk assessments. There has to be a work of integration with your ERP, because at the end of the day, what these software solutions aren't going to be able to do are track the papers that you're using in each book production. So a key element for the printers they need to think about in terms of their internal systems is that you're going to need to be able to book materials to each job. And a common misconception is that we're talking just about the paper reel. We are not. I mean, I've done a list of the components that go into a book. If you've got a really complicated hardcover book, you could be up to 15 different paper components. So you've got the cover board, you've got end papers, a whole list of items that could potentially need to be tracked and disclosed. Then afterwards, a lot of these software solutions provide for an API link with the EU Traces system. So you can then automate the preparation submission of DDS statements. And then they're going to help you along the way, but there's an awful lot of work to look at internally, both in terms of the ERP system, but also in terms of procedures and internal organization. So then some myths and pitfalls versus the truths, which I thought might be useful reference for people, because I hear a lot of rumors out there, etc. As I said earlier, FSC or PEFC unfortunately won't be there to save the day for most of us. We're going to have to look to find other solutions. Another one, I don't know if you might have heard of, is there was already in place actually a timber regulation in the EU. And so a lot of people are thinking, oh, maybe this will save us because there is a transition period planned within EUDR for EUTR, as it's called, until 2028. But unfortunately, EUTR didn't cover books, so we fall immediately under the scope of EUDR, so we don't get any respite there. Another misconception, unfortunately, which wasn't helped by the EU's most recent statement. So they published last week, they said costs of EUDR compliance reduced by 30%. Only need to submit a DDS once per year. But actually, when you look in the fine print, that isn't going to work for books. It would only work if you already had due diligence on all the papers you're going to use for the next year, and if you knew exactly what you're going to be producing for that period. So unfortunately, that's just not real world for our industry. Some of the pitfalls as well. So I don't think we should over-rely on mills, etc., to be providing the data, because at the end of the day, particularly for North American mills, the legal onus isn't on them. It's on the downstream players. And so you really need to be tough on the rest of your supply chain to ensure you're getting the data, not just geolocation data, but all the legality checks, etc., that need to go with it. That's a potential pitfall. And then afterwards, there's obviously going to be an incredibly complex supply chain that you're going to be opening up to. And so don't underestimate the data side of things. It's actually enormous, the data sets that you're talking about here. But then, it's incredibly complex, but there are some good news out there. So there are a number of exclusions from which we can benefit and make life a little bit easier. Any materials that are 100% recycled are excluded. And so, for instance, I mentioned hardcover earlier. Some of the grey board in there often is 100% recycled, so that's excluded. Packaging materials, so when you're sending books in cartons, the cartons themselves are excluded because they're the sole use of transporting the books. You only need to focus on the primary commodity that goes into a book, and I think it's probably 99.9% of cases, that is paper and timber. So, for instance, a leather-bound book, you wouldn't have to worry about the leather, even though that would fall under CASL. So that's some good news. And then I'm not sure if it's the case of anyone in this room, but if you're sending any books to end consumers within the EU, so not a retailer, not a wholesaler, not a publisher, those are excluded as well, because the thinking is they are buying from you in the US rather than buying on the EU market. Then the not so good news, from my discussions and others' discussions with mills, it's very, very difficult to get data still. So when we think about this regulation was due to come in at the end of last year, we're now April now, and I still can't get data from most mills, and most are saying they're not going to be able to provide data till the summer. So when we think about the book supply chain, about how long it takes to get paper through there, etc., that means that book production is unlikely to be compliant until Q3, Q4 of this year, which is dangerously close to the implementation date. So another thing to keep in mind is that there are likely to be significant inventories or massive inventories sloshing around the book supply chain that will not be compliant at the 31st of December. And that poses a real big issue today, particularly in the trade space where we're dealing with lots of inventory. And then, while it's great there are all those software solutions out there in the market to help us with EUDR compliance, unfortunately, it doesn't look like the industry has managed to come up with an industry-wide approach to this. And so we're going to get to a point now, mid-year, where people are going to have to make decisions about how they're dealing with this, and they're likely to choose a multitude of different solutions. So when you think about how complex this is, the number of actors in the supply chain, the number of different ERP solutions out there, that means that the number of integrations between these different software solutions, ERPs, mills, etc., is going to be phenomenal. So that's going to add an even more complexity to the solution. So here it's a bit of a compliance checklist of what you need to be looking to do. I won't take too long on this, probably conscious of time. But supply chain mapping, that really needs to be the first thing, and it's very difficult to do in this world because up until now, we haven't had to look at the supply chain in a particular granular fashion. But it's very important to do that early on to identify areas of potential risk of non-compliance, because you're going to have to deal with those areas of non-compliance. It might end up that you're talking to mills and saying, look, I need you guys to change your sources of pulp. You might need to consider changing paper supply for product, and you need to be compliant. You need to establish, of course, and document a due diligence system. I think the documentation bit is really, really important because I'm imagining that when the EU comes around to enforcing this, I don't think there are going to be many players out there who actually really are 100% compliant. And I think it's going to be really important to demonstrate the willingness and the effort that players are putting in to show compliance. Then afterwards, selection of due diligence platform. So we mentioned a few earlier, but you're obviously going to need to choose one of those solutions to provide the risk assessment, mitigation, etc. Solutions that you'll need, and to integrate those with your ERP. And then supplier engagement, as once you've done that supply chain mapping, you really need to engage with those suppliers, identify areas of risk, and address those together. And of course, it's particularly difficult for everyone in this room because the number of books that you're printing today, which are ending up in the EU market, I imagine there's got to be like fewer than 5%, etc. So it's going to be difficult not to imagine a world where you have two supply chains channels, one compliant and one non-compliant. So what should supply chain actors be doing now? As I said, I think you need to be looking quickly to find source of commodities, the pulp really, that are potentially non-compliant. And I think you'd probably be a little bit surprised when we look at that. I've certainly discovered a few myself, which I didn't suspect, given that we're 100% FSC. Engaging with suppliers, engaging with customers as well, because it's really important to understand what your customers are going to be asking from you. Customers, publishers are on that road as well. And certainly a lot of people that I've spoken to at these events, Publishers Association, etc., they're still on that journey, EUDR journey, where they don't really know what they need from their suppliers. So it's really important that we're all talking to each other and trying to come up with some kind of common understanding of at least what the raw material data needs to look like. Then, of course, internal systems, software solutions. And then this final point, I wouldn't underestimate the importance of it, because when I go back to the non-EU supply chain, when I've looked at it, I don't think it works unless all the actors, or at least a number of actors, have access to the EU tracer system to be able to consolidate and rationalize that data flow across the supply chain. So I would be looking now at how you could gain access to EU tracer system. The simplest way, as I said, is if you're outside the EU, just get an EURI number from Ireland. It's English speaking, maybe the easiest one there. Or you can look at setting up an EU entity. It's not very expensive, and that would provide you with potentially some possibilities afterwards, because then you could become an authorized representative for your European customers and potentially offer a bit of a service that other people might not be able to offer. Getting towards the end there, and then we'll save some time for Q&A, at least 5-10 minutes. I think it's important to remember that we're talking obviously just about EUDR now, but as everyone in this room knows, the number of regulations that are getting hurled at us are growing exponentially. I've listed a few on the right here, which are relevant. So I started off when I was working on EUDR thinking, oh my God, this is just a nightmare. It's been dreamt up by some bureaucrat in Brussels who hasn't got a clue about supply chains, etc., just creating an absolute nightmare for industry. And while that's still true, even though I've been working on it for 8 months, I believe there's also an opportunity here in terms of gaining a traceability and granularity of the supply chain that we could use moving forward. So what do I mean by that? I think the book has a number of challenges going into the future. It's got to be shown to be a sustainable product. We don't want people thinking all we're doing is cutting down forests and making books. So we have to demonstrate that. It's only really through gaining true visibility over our supply chain that we're going to be able to do that. And then also, certainly as far as the trade book market, less so for the academic one, there is still so much inefficiency in the system. At 31st of December, there's going to be hundreds of millions of books sitting in inventory that won't be compliant. There is still pulping rates in some publishers, 20, 30%. The idea that we get a handle on our supply chain and we start properly analyzing it to drive efficiency, both from a sustainability point of view, because all that waste is obviously energy and paper that shouldn't be needed, but also from a bottom line perspective, so that all the actors in the supply chain can find the profitability they need to invest in the future, and also that we render the book competitive with other media. That's really, really important in this incredibly digital world. So I think I'll stop there for some Q&A and discussion. I just left you with a little note from a fellow Brit who was also American, of course. Quote, "The pessimist sees difficulty in every opportunity. The optimist sees opportunity in every difficulty." And I certainly started off being the former, but I think there are definitely opportunities if we look beyond the complexity of EUDR that could serve us well into the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. We have a few minutes for Q&A, and just to let you guys know, as Matt mentioned, we will have the next session. We have representatives from two of those software companies that Matt mentioned, Liveo and Osapiens. So we're going to talk more in depth on the software side of things and what that looks like. But with that being said, if you've got questions, let me know. And of course, these slides will be available. I'll put them in the Whova app, for everybody to download later.
Matt, Baldwin, thank you. EUDR, the timber regulation, it's my understanding went into effect in 2010. It was signed into law.
Yep.
It took years for it actually to be implemented and for enforcement to happen. And it slowly, member state after member state, got there. But is there some expectation in Europe, or have you heard in any of your discussions, that maybe the same thing is going to go on here, that this could be a 10-year roadmap or longer?
Yeah, great question. So one of the reasons they brought in EUDR was because EUDR didn't work very well at addressing deforestation. So they almost were so hard in the definition of regulation and the enforcement that you saw earlier, because EUDR took 10 years to properly implement. I think, quite frankly, as you're peeling an onion with this kind of regulation, you see that it is very, very, very complex to demonstrate compliance for all products. And I don't believe that all the actors will be able to do so. So what I'm imagining is, while they won't water down the regulation or they won't postpone it, I believe that the competent authorities will be relatively lenient in the first year or two of implementation. And you've got to remember, who are they targeting with EUDR? We mentioned there are 7 commodities out there. It's not like books known as being, the bad guy in the room. I think it's far more likely that they make examples of palm oil and these other commodities before they come looking for, a book publisher or a book printer and hammering us from a very, pragmatic point of view. Yeah.
Well done, Matt. Thank you very much. You mentioned that by June 30th, there's going to be this gradation of what countries are good or bad. It's probably going to be like this, just one size fits all. It sounds like that's what it's going to be, which leads to this. Is there anything that you're hearing from the North American market, particularly the United States, in terms of like telling Europe to just go away? Is there any political stuff in the background that the EU is worried about from North America?
Yeah, of course, there's that conversation going on. Of course, we've got tariffs. There's going to be negotiations between the EU and North America. And I'd be very surprised if EUDR wasn't part of those negotiations. I mean, it's really difficult to know because even when it was delayed last year, they played their cards very, very close to their chest, and they kept insisting up until the nth hour they weren't going to delay it. So you can't rule any of those things out, but I think they'd have some serious egg on their face if they were to give in to North America or provide any compromise there, or indeed delay it again. So if I was a betting man, I'd bet that they're going to avoid any political fallout, like you say, by providing standard risk for all countries, and then probably monitor as they go forward with the compliance checks where the offenders are, because then they've got some kind of objective justification for giving a country a higher risk. But I don't know. It'd be interesting to see how it evolves. But I mean, I guess the thing is, it's going to take months and months to come up with a solution. So you'd be a brave man to bet on it, being kicked down the road again and not address it now. I don't think really companies have much of a choice but to properly look at it.
What is the reason, the thought process behind why is packaging not included? With the amount of increasing packaging that's going on, it just seems like that would be an obvious target.
Yeah, great question. So just for clarification, packaging, if you're sending packaging on its own as a product, is within scope. The only time it isn't within scope is when it's being used to transport another product within scope. So yeah, that's devil in the detail. So whereas if you put books in a carton, that would be excluded. But if you were to send, for instance, pallets of cartons that you're selling into the EU, those would be subject to EUDR. It's complex.
So also to give some context, I spoke with several publishers over the last 6 months to talk about EUDR and ask them specifically for their ideal scenario. And I mean, I'm making this up, but this is effectively what they said. So if they did a 10,000 run order on a book, they don't know initially how many will be ordered by the EU, right, in their sales channels, right? So what they want to do is they want to print 10,000, stick them in their warehouse, and whenever their European side calls and says, hey, we need 1,000 of those books to sell here in Europe, they just want to pick off the boxes, grab 10% of those boxes, and ship them to the EU. So that means all 10,000 need to be compliant and be ready to go because they don't know when or which box or whatever the case may be. So, and the funny thing is, a lot of these publishers, that's probably what it is. It's 5 to 10% of what they print. And so their dream scenario is all of you who are printing the 95% will just make sure that you're doing that so that they can ship their 5 to 10% whenever they want and it be compliant. And that's not just from one publisher, that's from multiple publishers that I've spoken with over the last year or so.
Yeah.
So with that being said, Matt, do you think there is going to be a larger push for maybe folks in this room to partner with EU-based printers for a more distributed print model so that they're going to say, well, no, we'll print the 9,000 and we're going to have our partner in France or wherever print the 1,000 and those can be compliant. And that's what we're going to tell our publisher because this is potentially untenable.
Yeah, I mean the issue of that is, like you said earlier, you can map the direct sales, there's all the indirect sales. And again, if you're managing non-compliant and compliant products, one of the things we didn't talk about is sharing of data from the publisher down to retail. So currently that's using what we call the Onyx feed. So you have a bunch of metadata that's at the ISBN level. So the theory goes that to demonstrate that those books can be sold on the EU market within the Onyx file, we're going to have a DDS reference. So as soon as you have two channels of products, non-compliant outside EU, compliant within the EU, you come up against a whole bunch of issues. And inevitably that's involving, if you're starting to split print runs, that's adding cost. It's also adding complexity and more work. And all of those things people are very, very reluctant within publishing to look at, because we're all really going to be adding an awful lot of work just to comply if we don't change the supply chain. So added changes within the supply chain, very reluctant. But that said, it is going to have to be, I guess, like an ultimate backup solution. But we find capacity within Europe to be able to produce locally when we're unable to render the product compliant from elsewhere, for sure. But I see that only as probably being a transitional thing. Yeah.
Matt, before we kick that off, one other question. What about China? Because they've said they maybe don't care about EUDR.
So it's really interesting. So the Chinese printers, I must say the reaction has been really, really positive, very proactive. They've been doing lots of changes within their own internal systems. Where they come a cropper is the paper mills and the pulp supply. And so right now they're in a little bit of a panic because there are several mills which aren't going to be able to provide the data. But apparently some of the mills are looking at having two batches of production. So they're going to be buying specific pulp for EUDR compliant paper and run separate production runs for EUDR compliant papers and non-compliant papers. So that's really interesting, but they're already being proactive, if you like, on adjusting their supply chains in those respects. And they're very well down the data road as well. So I'll be honest with you, I've been kind of pleasantly surprised by the reaction over there, but you've got to remember that they're massively exposed to the EU market. There's a huge amount of exports hitting that market from those actors.